They called him just her black stepfather. They laughed at his shoes and whispered behind his back. But when Lena started crying, and his name echoed from the stage, their smirks vanished. The late afternoon sun poured golden light through the high windows of the university auditorium, casting long shadows across the polished floors and ivory linen-covered tables. It was graduation day, a day meant for celebration, for closure, for new beginnings. But for Lena Harper, the joy was laced with tension. She walked slowly through the reception hall, her diploma in hand, the steady tap of her black heels matching the pace of a man walking beside her in well-worn dress shoes. That man was Dwayne Johnson, her stepfather. Quiet, steady, and standing tall despite the sharp contrast of his deep brown skin against the pale sea of white faces around them. His navy blazer was a little faded, his khaki slacks creased just so. The tie she'd helped him pick out that morning sat slightly askew, but his posture was calm, his expression unreadable. No flash, no grand gestures. But in the way he looked at Lena, there was a pride that needed no words. Lena adjusted the gold tassel on her cap, scanning the crowd. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air. Her mother's side of the family, the Crowleys, stood near the refreshment table, all pearls and perfect posture, clutching glasses of sparkling cider like props in a play. The whispers began as soon as she approached. "Is that the driver she brought?" someone murmured. "I heard he's just her stepfather, only married into the family. She could have brought someone respectable at least." Lena's stomach tightened. She glanced at Dwayne. His expression didn't change, not a flinch, not a wince. He stared straight ahead as if the judgment wasn't for him, as if it slid off him without reaching his skin. But Lena knew better. She saw the slight clench of his jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted in his pockets. Her mother hadn't come. Another year, another excuse. This time she said it was too far, even though the flight from Connecticut was barely 2 hours. But Dwayne, he'd driven 7 hours straight through the night. No complaint, no pause, just to be there. And yet here he was, treated like a shadow instead of the father he had been. Lena stayed close to him, resisting the urge to lash out, to defend him. She wanted to say, "This man helped me survive when my own mother gave up." But instead, she forced a tight smile and moved to greet a professor, pulling Dwayne with her. Not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't trust herself, not to cry. He said nothing about the looks, he never did. But as they passed a table where a Crowley cousin shifted her handbag to the far side of her chair with theatrical disdain, Lena's hand gently found his elbow, anchoring them together. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Neither of them were going anywhere. The polished laughter from the reception hall drifted around them, polite and practiced, filling the silences. But for Lena, one sharp comment cut through like glass on Illy. "I wonder what her real father would think," someone said, their voice slicing the air. Lena froze, her hand tightening on the edge of a dessert plate, her shoulders stiffening, her breath catching. Dwayne, who had been admiring the graduation banner stretched across the stage, turned to her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. Gently, his calloused hand reached across the table and touched hers, grounding her. His touch was soft, light, like a bookmark slipping between pages. And in that moment, he pulled her back to herself, reminding her that no whisper or glance could define them. Memories flooded Lena's mind as Dwayne's quiet touch steadied her. They weren't memories told through grand gestures or elaborate stories, but moments that stitched together the fabric of her life. She was 10 years old again, standing on the edge of the school parking lot, watching her classmates point and laugh, as Dwayne pulled up in that old, rust-stained pickup truck, with the passenger door that groaned every time it opened. The other parents arrived in shiny SUVs, dressed in tailored suits and silk scarves, stepping out with the kind of polished confidence that silenced whispers. But Dwayne, he wore a uniform shirt with grease stains on the collar, hands marked, from a long shift at the mechanic shop. "Is that your uncle?" a kid snorted, loud enough for the group to hear. "Looks more like a delivery guy." Lena had wanted to vanish, to disappear beneath the cracked sidewalk. She'd slid into the seat of the truck without saying a word, her gaze fixed on the floor. But Dwayne, He had just smiled, handed her a paper cup of hot chocolate, and said softly, "Tough day?" He didn't need her to explain. He just knew. The images in her mind shifted to the countless science fair nights when the living room transformed into a chaotic mess of wires, poster boards, and colored papers. Dwayne would pore over instruction booklets like a college student prepping for finals, even though he'd never finished high school himself. He cheered louder than anyone when she won third place, and later that night, he'd fixed her nightlight without asking for thanks. She recalled the nights he read To Kill a Mockingbird. To her, his voice steady and deliberate, never skipping a word, even though his eyes moved slowly across the page. She remembered him sitting through her violin recitals, clapping as if she had played at Carnegie Hall, even when every note was slightly off-key. But what stood out most wasn't a specific moment. It was the way he showed up. After her biological father left, packing one suitcase with a hollow excuse about needing space and never returning, Dwayne didn't fill the air with empty promises. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "I'll try." He just showed up the next morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. For every parent-teacher conference, dentist appointment, and college tour, he was there. He never asked for recognition or praise. He just stayed. Back in the present, Lena's throat tightened, her eyes stinging as she fought the tears. She watched Dwayne now, his quiet strength wrapped in that thrift store suit. His hands tucked calmly into his pockets, standing tall against the undercurrent of disdain that rippled from her mother's side of the family. The Crowleys may have laughed behind his back, their voices as polished and cutting as their pearls and pressed collars. But he hadn't wavered. He looked out of place among the marble floors and champagne flutes, but to Lena he had never looked more right. She slid her hand under his. "You okay?" she whispered softly. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're the one in heels," he said, his wink so subtle it made her laugh quietly, despite the tightness in her chest. The biting comment about her real father still lingered in the air, sharp as glass. But Lena let it fade, not because it didn't hurt, but because the people who said it didn't understand what real meant. She looked at Dwayne, and in her chest bloomed a truth she hadn't allowed herself to speak aloud for years. He didn't need a title to be her father. He just chose to be one. And that choice, made quietly, daily, without fanfare, was worth more than any blood tie or public recognition. The university auditorium hushed as the chancellor approached the podium, her voice resonating through the high ceilings, each word echoing like a drumbeat across the polished floors. "And now," she said with a practiced yet warm tone, "we begin our honorary recognitions." Cameras clicked as the audience straightened in their seats, anticipation rippling through the crowd like an electric current. Lena sat near the front, her posture poised, but her heart was pounding against her ribs. There had been whispers, hints, from a mentor, a congratulatory email that was just a little too cryptic, but she didn't dare assume. Not today. Behind her, the Crowley family clustered like a private exhibit of wealth and condescension, their pearls and pressed linen shining. Under the lights, their gazes flickering over Dwayne, who stood quietly at the back wall. He wasn't seated with them, he never was. Instead, he stood with his hands clasped in front of him, nodding politely to anyone who passed. His thrift store suit freshly pressed but just a bit too large at the shoulders, the cuffs slightly frayed. His well-worn shoes, though clean, were scuffed at the toes, a testament to years of work, not style. One of Lena's cousins leaned closer to another, her voice sharp and theatrical. "Maybe he's here to clean up after," she said with a stifled laugh, a program clutched in her hand. Another cousin added louder than necessary, "Seriously, who shows up to graduation dressed like the maintenance crew?" Lena heard it, every word like a slap, but she didn't turn around. She didn't flinch, didn't glare, didn't correct them. Instead, her hand rested gently over her lap, the other clutching the graduation program just tightly enough to leave faint creases. She glanced at Dwayne, standing in quiet resilience, his eyes focused on the stage, as if the murmurs and whispers around him were nothing but distant echoes. He'd heard them too, of course he had. But his posture remained steady, his hands clasped lightly before him. The Chancellor continued calling out names, each announcement met with polite applause and bursts of camera flashes. Behind Lena, the Crowleys clapped with detached enthusiasm, their eyes flickering with subtle disdain every time a new name was announced, every time a scholarship was linked to a recognizable last name. But then, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The Chancellor's voice softened, her smile widening, her tone warming in a way that seemed to hint at something unexpected. "There is one award today," she said, her voice carrying a note of anticipation, "that we did not announce in advance. A special recognition for extraordinary personal sacrifice, leadership through adversity, and lifelong commitment to community and family." A murmur swept through the audience, a ripple of curiosity breaking the polite rhythm of the ceremony. Lena felt the hairs on her arms rise, a prickle of something electric running along her spine. The whispers behind her fell silent. "This individual," the Chancellor continued, "has inspired not only their child who graduates today with top honors, but countless others in our local outreach program. Their humility may have kept them from the spotlight, but today we make sure they're seen." There was a beat of silence, the kind that makes a room hold its breath, and then the Chancellor spoke the name. Dwayne Johnson. For a fraction of a second, the entire auditorium seemed to stop breathing. Gasps echoed, sharp intakes of breath, camera flashes bursting to life, illuminating stunned faces. Lena's mouth fell open, her eyes darting instinctively toward the back of the room. There he stood, still in his slightly oversized brown suit, still with those weathered shoes. His hands clasped in front of him, like he wasn't quite sure what had just happened. But now, all eyes were on him. The whispers of mockery were gone, replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. Even Lena's smug cousin, the one who'd joked about Dwayne's shoes, now stared at him as if she'd seen a ghost. Dwayne didn't move right away, as if he needed a moment to process, a moment to believe his name had really been called. And then, with quiet humility, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. As Dwayne stepped forward, the clatter of glasses and murmurs of idle conversation faded into silence. The air in the auditorium grew thick with anticipation. The crowd's attention locked onto the man who had been standing quietly at the back of the room. The Chancellor's voice warmed with emotion as she continued, her words now carrying weight and purpose. "Before we continue," she said, adjusting the microphone, "I want to take a moment to share a story, one that's never been fully told until now." The audience quieted further. Phones were slipped into pockets, chairs shifted. As people leaned in, even the most distracted guests sensed something rare was about to unfold. Dwayne remained near the exit, his hands still clasped, his posture neutral, but his eyes locked on the dean as she began to speak. "Nearly 12 years ago, during rush hour, a bomb detonated in the lower tracks of the 7th Street subway station," she said, her voice steady but solemn. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. "Panic swept the platform. People were injured. Many were trapped. While most ran for safety, one man ran toward the smoke." Whispers surged like a wave through the crowd, murmurs of recognition, flickering across faces. Lena's heart raced. The story, it sounded familiar, too familiar, but her mind couldn't place why. The dean pressed on. This man, with no formal training, no weapon, and no thought for his own safety, pulled 8 passengers from the wreckage. He administered CPR, used his shirt to stop someone's bleeding, and when emergency responders arrived, he disappeared without giving his name. Somewhere in the audience, a soft gasp broke the silence. "I remember that story," someone murmured, their voice threading through the quiet. Lena felt a chill skitter across her skin as flashes of memory surfaced. A news clip from years ago, a subway bombing, headlines mentioning a subway Samaritan, a mystery hero who had vanished into anonymity. She turned slightly, her gaze finding Dwayne. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, but his eyes shone with something unspoken. The dean's voice continued to unfold the story, threading a narrative that now entwined itself with the man who had raised her. He avoided the press, he never sought reward. But when we tracked anonymous donations made to the trauma center that treated the victims, she said, her voice softening, we found a trail, and it led us to someone standing right here in this very room. There was a beat of silence, so profound it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then the dean's next words shattered the quiet like a clap of thunder. Dwayne Johnson! For a second the world seemed to pause. Then came the gasps, audible and sharp. Camera flashes strobed across the auditorium like bursts of lightning. Lena's pulse surged as she turned fully to see Dwayne. There he stood, his posture unchanged, but now every eye was on him. The same people who had laughed and whispered, those who had mistaken him for a driver, a janitor, or worse, sat frozen, their expressions a blend of astonishment and disbelief. Even the smug cousin, the one who had joked about him cleaning up, after the event, now stared at Dwayne with an expression of stunned recognition, as though seeing him for the first time. For a moment, Dwayne didn't move. He stood as though frozen, processing the reality of his name being called in a room that had once overlooked him. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to walk. There was no swagger, no theatrical flair, just steady, deliberate steps, the walk of a man who had never sought a spotlight but was now undeniably in its glow. Lena's chest tightened, her throat constricting with emotion. Her eyes shimmered as she rose from her seat, clapping first, soft, steady, then louder as others joined in. The applause spread, row by row, until the entire room echoed with the sound of recognition, of truth finally revealed. And through it all, Dwayne Johnson walked toward the stage, the quiet hero they had never truly seen until now. Dwayne's footsteps echoed softly as he approached the stage. His posture was composed, his stride steady, his head held high, not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had never needed recognition. The Chancellor met him at the edge of the stage, placing a hand over her heart, her gesture warm and sincere. She motioned for him to step closer. "Mr. Johnson," she said into the microphone, her voice ringing clear and reverent. "You are a quiet architect of change. Your years mentoring students, volunteering for night classes, tutoring single parents, and anonymously funding community programs, we see you now. And today we recognize it publicly." Another round of applause surged through the room, louder than before, echoing against the polished walls. Dwayne didn't blink at the praise. His eyes weren't searching the crowd for approval. Instead, they found Lena's, locked with hers across the sea of faces. She stood now, her smile trembling but radiant, her hands clasped as if holding the moment together. Dwayne took the mic from the Chancellor, his large hands steady, his grip firm but unassuming. He cleared his throat, the sound low and resonant. "I wasn't expecting this," he began, his voice plain but carrying a quiet strength. "I didn't do any of this for recognition. I did it because someone once did it for me." The room stilled, a hush falling as his words settled over the crowd like a blanket. "My stepdaughter is the most brilliant person I know," he continued, his gaze flicking back to Lena with a hint of pride. "I knew long before anyone else that she'd make it, not because of her grades or awards, but because she gets back up every time life tries to knock her down." A few sniffles echoed from the audience. Even the photographers, their cameras, and lowered, seemed caught in the moment. "I'm not her biological father," Dwayne said, his voice unwavering but softer now. "But when her dad walked away, I knew that little girl needed someone who would stay. That's all I ever tried to do, stay, support, and let her know she was never alone." The stillness in the air was palpable, the kind that only follows an unvarnished truth spoken plainly. Dwayne glanced down at the award in his hand, an engraved glass plaque reflecting the auditorium lights, and shook his head as if even now he couldn't quite believe it. "I didn't think people noticed," he murmured, his words carrying a humility that struck deeper than any grand speech. "But I guess they do." He stepped away from the mic, offering a quiet nod of gratitude, his expression calm, though a hint of emotion glistened at the corners of his eyes. The applause that followed was louder, fuller, more genuine. It wasn't the hollow clapping of polite obligation. It was the sound of a room acknowledging a truth it had been blind to for too long. Back at her table, Lena stood, her hands trembling, not from shock, but from an overwhelming sense of pride. Her eyes shimmered with tears, her chest rising with deep, steady breaths. She no longer cared about the stairs, about the whispers that once trailed behind them. In that moment, the entire room had witnessed the truth she had always known. Dwayne Johnson wasn't just the man they'd mocked for being her stepfather. He was the hero standing where heroes belonged, at the front of the room, under the lights, with his story finally told. And as he returned to his place, his steps were calm, his shoulders squared, his presence radiating a quiet strength. The applause followed him, echoing long after he'd descended the steps, a chorus of respect and recognition for the man who had shown the world what true integrity looked like. As the applause slowly faded into a lingering hum, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted. It was no longer filled with whispers of doubt or laughter of condescension. The Crowley family, once so poised and confident in their dismissive glances and cutting remarks, now sat awkwardly, their faces a mix of confusion and forced politeness. The weight of their earlier judgment hung in the air like a silent reprimand. They exchanged uneasy glances, each unsure of what to say or how to react. A few of them, those who had been the loudest in their mockery, now found themselves fumbling for words. One cousin, who had earlier joked about Dwayne's shoes, mumbled, "I didn't know," his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Another, who had loudly questioned his presence, hesitated before offering a weak nod of acknowledgement. Even Lena's Aunt Carol, who had always been quick to judge and slow to listen, approached hesitantly, her voice faltering. "We didn't realize," she said, her words barely above a whisper. Dwayne looked at her, his expression steady, calm, and unwavering. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment. He simply replied, "You didn't ask." The simplicity of his words struck harder than any accusation could have. It was not a retort, not a rebuke, but a quiet statement of fact, a truth that echoed through the room louder than any speech. The realization dawned not just on the Crowleys, but on the entire room. There had been no need for cruelty, no reason for whispered judgments. Their silence and their assumptions had painted a narrative that was never theirs to write. Dwayne's simple, steady presence had unraveled it all. Lena's pride in that moment was palpable, radiating through her quiet smile and the way she stood just a little taller. She didn't need to speak. The pride in her expression, the gentle curve of her mouth, the warmth in her eyes, it all spoke volumes. They walked together past the marble columns, through the maze of polite guests and once dismissive relatives. No one dared to whisper now. Their steps were unhurried, steady, as though they were walking not just out of a room but into a new chapter, one where the world had finally seen what Lena had always known. Outside the auditorium, the air was different. It wasn't just the fading light of the afternoon or the breeze rustling the trees. It was the quiet that followed, a silence heavy with the weight of realization. Even those who had never spoken to Dwayne before now watched him with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Lena felt the shift too. For years, she had carried the quiet weight of knowing, of loving, of understanding the man who had stood by her through everything. Now, for the first time, the world seemed to catch up. They walked past the stunned faces, past the people who had once mistaken him for a driver, a janitor, a shadow in the background. But Dwayne's steps were light, his presence grounded, as though the weight of years of silence and dismissal had finally been lifted. Lena's hand rested lightly on his arm, anchoring them together, a silent affirmation of everything he had ever meant to her. There was no need for more words. They didn't look back. There was no longer any reason to. Inside the reception hall, the mood had shifted from smug superiority to quiet reflection. Conversations were subdued, laughter replaced by murmured acknowledgements. The Crowleys, once so confident in their polished veneer, now seemed smaller, their postures less assured. Even their once effortless air of superiority had cracked under the weight of Dwayne's simple truth. And as Lena and Dwayne left the hall, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet, they didn't just leave behind whispers. They left a legacy of quiet strength, unwavering love, and undeniable dignity. Back home, the quiet hum of the world. Outside was replaced by the soft rustle of Lena's steps as she moved through the living room. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor, where shadows stretched like memories. The air still carried the faint scent of fresh flowers, remnants from the bouquet she'd been handed after the ceremony. On the kitchen counter sat half of a chocolate cake, untouched, a simple reminder of Dwayne's quiet traditions. He always brought one home to celebrate, whether it was a graduation or simply making it through a tough week. Lena stood by the refrigerator, her hands brushing against the smooth, cool surface as she held two frames. The one was a crayon drawing she had made in 3rd grade, depicting a crooked house with a tall stick figure labeled, "My Hero Dwayne." It had been on the fridge for years, edges curling, tape yellowed with time. The other was new, a glossy, freshly printed photo of Dwayne standing on the stage, the medal draped around his neck, the spotlight casting a halo around him, applause frozen mid-motion in the background. She paused, her fingers hesitating over the worn edges of the drawing, before she carefully peeled it off the fridge and tucked it into a memory box on the shelf. Then, with deliberate care, she placed the new photo in its place, front and center. It was a quiet elevation, a shift so subtle it felt more profound than any loud declaration. She stepped back, looking at the photo, and for the first time in years, she felt there was nothing more to prove. Not to her mother's side of the family, not to classmates, not to anyone. Just the truth, standing there on the fridge for the world, or at least their little corner of it, to see. Dwayne walked in then, drying his hands on a dish towel, his steps as unassuming as ever. He glanced at the fridge, then at Lena, his eyes softening. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice low and even. Lena turned to him, her voice thick with emotion but her smile gentle. "I know," she replied, "but I wanted the world to see what I've always seen." They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them, filled not with discomfort but with something deeper, recognition, gratitude, and love. The ordinary sounds of the world outside, children's laughter, a distant lawnmower, a dog barking at a squirrel, filtered in through the open window, blending into the quiet, domestic rhythm of their home. But within those walls, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with grand speeches or extravagant gestures, but with the quiet, steady presence of a man who had never needed a stage to be seen as a hero. Lena and Dwayne settled into the living room, their bodies sinking into the familiar embrace of worn cushions. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was warm and full, a shared understanding that words couldn't quite capture. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of gold and lavender. Life continued its ordinary pace, cars driving by, a neighbor's radio playing softly. But for Lena and Dwayne, the world felt subtly different. It wasn't about proving something to others anymore. It was about acknowledging the truth that had always been there, waiting for the world to catch up. And now, finally, it had. This story wasn't just about a man standing quietly in the back of an auditorium. It was a testament to the power of quiet strength, of love that chooses to stay, of integrity that doesn't seek recognition but deserves it all the same. Dwayne Johnson's journey wasn't a tale of fame or fortune. It was a story of showing up, of steady hands holding together a family, of standing tall in the face of whispers, of simply being there when it mattered most. It was a story of a man who, without fanfare or applause, had been a hero long before the world gave him a stage. And now, as the world finally saw him for who he was, Lena's heart swelled with pride. This was the man who had quietly replaced her childhood drawing with a truth that needed no explanation. This was the man whose presence had always been steady, whose footsteps through her life had been quiet but undeniable. He wasn't a man who wore a cape or stood behind a podium to seek the limelight. He was the man who carried her through every challenge, every quiet victory, every moment when the world tried to convince her she wasn't enough. And now, he stood in the light, not because he asked for it, but because his actions demanded it. For anyone who has ever doubted the power of simple acts of love and support, Dwayne's story is a resounding answer. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was the most unwavering. He wasn't the man with the flashiest title or the most polished appearance. He was the man who, when others turned away, stayed. When others doubted, he believed. When others whispered, he walked forward. His strength wasn't in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, consistent presence that changes lives without needing acknowledgement. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the quiet heroes in your own life, the ones who stay without asking for thanks, the ones who support without expectation, then don't just let it end here. Share this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear that love and resilience come in many forms. Leave a comment below and tell us about your own quiet hero. Someone who stood by you, who believed in you, who made a difference without needing recognition. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because we believe in sharing stories that lift us up, that remind us of the power of quiet courage, and that honor the heroes who walk beside us every day, in a world that too often overlooks quiet strength. Dwayne's story stands as a reminder that true heroism isn't about grand gestures or public accolades. It's about showing up. It's about love that chooses to stay. It's about dignity that speaks louder than words. And as Lena and Dwayne left the auditorium, their heads held high, they carried not just a memory, but a truth that now, finally, the world had seen.